Today's topic, we're going to continue what we talked about last week, which is coming out of crisis confidently. We put a focus today on financial preparedness and safety. Like I just mentioned, please do mute your microphone unless you're speaking. We are going to have quite a bit of open discussion today, but since we have so many people joining us on the call, please just try to limit your questions and comments to about 30 seconds or so. The format of today's little program is going to be 2 special guests, and then we're going to have some open discussion to talk about what you guys want to talk about. As I mentioned, we should be joined here shortly by Ray Cronin. If you don't know, he's also a contributor to Michael and I's book, The ABCs of Plutonium Private Club Leadership, and actually a great time to be reading books if your club's not back up and running yet. It's a perfect buy for you. We're also going to be talking to Alan Achatz, who is going to talk to us about safety procedures. We've covered safety quite a bit during these, but Alan is the expert in the industry, so we're going to give him some time today to talk about any new things that he thinks clubs should be doing on the safety end of things. If you don't know me, I'm Gabe. I do have the Private Club Radio Show and the Let's Play Through show on YouTube. Actually going to be doing a pretty cool golf vlog from Ecuador. No one has ever done a golf trip and filmed it from Ecuador on YouTube, and so today will be a first ever premiere for that country, which is kind of cool. So if you're around today at 3 o'clock, I'd love for you to check it out. We're going to be doing like a live premiere. I want to get into some resources now for the industry. We've been giving away this book, and again, right now it's probably a very timely time for your membership committee or your membership director at your club to be reading something like this. It's a really short read. It talks about the basics of telling a great story for your club, and it's absolutely free. So if you'd like a copy for yourself, for your membership director, for your board, or for your membership committee, just let me know. Shoot me an email. You should all have my email by now, or leave me a little message in the chat, and I'll make sure that you get a complimentary copy of that book. A couple other announcements, some great information that got shared this week. We talked to Frank Vane on Private Club Radio. It hasn't actually aired on the podcast yet, but I have a video up on YouTube on my personal YouTube channel. So just search for my name on YouTube, and there's a personal channel for me where I talk private club stuff. And Frank and I chatted about what clubs are going to look like. So again, really timely information. He had a lot of interesting things to say in terms of, especially from an architectural standpoint, the McMahon Group, that's their background, how clubhouses will look here into the future and the new types of amenities that we might start to see. So great conversation with Frank there. On the podcast this week, I talked to Miles Tucker, the GM over at Hillcrest, as well as Jeff over at Black Hawk Country Club. And we talked about financials. So we're going to hear from Ray a little bit about financials today, hopefully. And this is also a great resource for you, which is on the Private Club Radio Show. That episode dropped on Monday. And just a recap of some other great resources that we're trying to put together here. And by the way, if you've got a great resource, let me know. That way I can share it with the group. But Tony Shibiyama of S&K Insurance has put together basically a COVID-19 HR resources pack. She's also doing some consulting at a very, very reasonable rate. I think it's $250. You get the pack and some consulting time with her. And she may be joining us on the call if she already isn't. So reach out to Choni directly, and that's a really good resource for you guys. Let's see. The other guy I had on, Jason Petronis. I know a number of people have reached out to him already. He is doing the QR code scorecard. So basically your golf members, if you're a golf course, go up and scan a QR code. They can start scoring right from their mobile phone. They don't have to download an app. I think it's a really great device that you should check out. And if you've got Forties, by the way, it kind of integrates already with Forties, which is kind of cool. And then a number of you reached out to me after last week's show. I'd love to hear if anyone's on this call that did get in touch with him, but I gave the resource that I've got for hand sanitizer, guy here in Tampa. who has a direct line of distribution to hand sanitizer. I know a lot of clubs are trying to get their hands on some, no pun intended. So if you need that contact, I'm happy to put you in touch, and hopefully he was able to help the people that I put in touch with last week. All right, so I'm going to stop my share here, and let's see. Did Ray Cronin, did he make it on the call yet? Looks like he did.
I did. Thank you, Gabe.
Hey, Ray. Thanks for joining us, man. I wanted you, obviously you're the expert in the industry on the financial side of things, and I wanted to pick your brain a little bit for our friends here on the call today about setting their club up to get through the rest of 2020 here. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, I have my hat on. It's a little informal because my hair looks like a mop until I can get my hair cut.
Not alone.
I was watching one of the talking news shows the other night, and Bill Bennett was on, and his hair looked like mine. It's like a mop too. But the COVID crisis, I think the way we characterized it in the white paper we presented on the topic is the virus is an issue, it's not the issue. If you go back to 1980, and I picked 1980 for two reasons. One, I graduated from college that year. We were in the deepest recession at the time since the Depression at that time. And it's 40 years of time. And I think in terms of the virus and what's going on, and thinking about clubs, thinking about economic growth and decline. So since January of 1980 through March of 2020, there were 483 months. If you look at the United States, and let's throw North America in because Canada and the US kind of are in the same cycle business-wise. 12% of the time since January of 1980, the United States has been in recession. So that means that the economy is declining. Technically, the definition of a recession is 2 sequential quarters of GDP decline. So the assumption is that we're in a recession now. We won't know until the second quarter GDP is released, but it's likely we will see 2 sequential quarters of decline. But the way we looked at it was, when you look at what your clubs are going to do to react to this virus crisis financially, we think it's the strategic approach is to understand where our club was financially entering the crisis. And the club industry sorts itself very neatly into 3 buckets entering this crisis, what we call red bucket clubs, yellow bucket clubs, and green bucket clubs. Red bucket clubs do not have enough members, they have weak balance sheets, and their net worth has been declining consistently over time. Those red bucket clubs we would refer to are in what it really could be considered a severe financial distress. They're under distress coming into the crisis. On the other end of the spectrum, a quarter of the industry is a green bucket club. Those clubs have waiting lists. Those clubs have strong balance sheets. And those clubs have net worth that's growing in the upper quartile of the industry, which means a 5% or more compounded annual growth rate. And we refer to those clubs as clubs that are growing purposefully. So they've literally chosen to grow with intent. They're investing in the member experience. They're driving the club forward. That's half the industry. And then you get the other half of the industry, which are the yellow bucket clubs, and they're somewhere in between. On one end of that spectrum, they abut the red bucket clubs. So those are clubs with a barely adequate number of members, a barely adequate balance sheet, and a barely adequate member experience. And on the other end of that bucket, you get clubs that are abutting the green bucket clubs, where they have an adequate number of members, an adequate balance sheet, and an adequate growth of net worth over time. And net worth is the most critical financial indicator we've discovered. It represents 2 things together, literally. One is how relevant the club is, and one is a club's ability to aggregate the capital it needs to reinvest in the future. So we think that the key to the whole virus crisis is to realize that the economic downturn that's associated with it is part of the 12% of the time over a long period of time that the country is declining economically. But it's not a reason to hack away at the member experience and cut costs and cut prices, which clubs did in the last recession. That won't work. That won't provide the outcome we want. Clubs don't compete on price, they compete on value. And if you have low prices and a poor member experience, you're not going to make the headway you want. We need a good member experience or a great member experience, and we need to pay for that to have it. And that's what will drive the club forward. So we're trying to get clubs to not react tactically to this thing, but to react strategically by knowing what bucket we're in and how do we change what bucket we're in as we look down the road. And that's a strategic approach to this crisis, as opposed to simply, hey, we're in a recession, we got to cut the expenses, we got to lower the initiation fee, we got to have dues specials to get members in, etc. That's not the approach to take.
I agree 100% with that. I think you're dead on in terms of, and I think a lot of clubs have taken that approach as well. I know a number of people on this call throughout the weeks have talked about the fact that they've kept their membership pretty stable, and certainly in terms of fees and initiations, they haven't really made any major drastic moves. But for clubs that might be hurting, Ray, what would be some of the solutions that you think that would be viable right now?
So if you're a red bucket club or a yellow bucket club and you want to become a yellow or green bucket club respectively, we believe that we have the data that demonstrates this point, or maybe even proves it. The key to success, and by the way, we've looked at this. If you go back and look at the 2009 recession, there were clubs that came out of that recession as green bucket clubs that today, 11 years later, are now red bucket clubs. And there were clubs that came out of that recession as red bucket clubs that are now green bucket clubs. So over a 10-year period, this is not static, it's dynamic. Clubs can, just like any business, they can move across the spectrum. But we believe the key to moving up on the spectrum as opposed to down is to have a forward-looking capital plan that's done in a complete top-to-bottom manner that assures a club has the money to reinvest in what we call obligatory capital, which is repair and replacement of the assets we own. And to your point that you, Gabe, often talk about, aspirational capital to add to the assets and then broaden the member experience such that it's relevant today.
Yeah.
So it's all about having the capital to keep investing in the club to drive a club forward. That's what we believe the turnaround point is. And the clubs that aren't in that bucket don't have the plan. That's why they're in the bucket to begin with.
Yeah. I know for my own business, it's not a club obviously, but in my own business, I wish I would have had a little bit more just reserve cash. And I think a lot of clubs, you know, they're probably in the same position I am, where I think we all wish we would have put a little aside for a rainy day. What would be your suggestion to clubs to start to build up funds like that, so that next time something like this happens, they're prepared?
That's a great question. So, you know, I'll answer it two ways. One way is the simple answer and the specific answer, but our data indicates that 3/4 of the clubs in the country are not generating enough capital. Now, on one end of that spectrum, it's a serious lack of capital. On the other end, it's marginal. But the way, you know, that we measure that is two ways. One is we actually measure how depreciated the asset base is, and that's in the introduction. You showed your book. Michael's book, you know, that talks about the balance sheet. We have a measure called the net to gross property, plant, and equipment ratio that gives a club a very clear indication of how much deferred maintenance exists. So deferred maintenance is negative reserves, to your point. Like right now, I got to redo my front lawn. I'm sitting in my office looking at the front lawn, and I wish I had accumulated, to your point, a little more capital over time, so it would be just easy to get the guy to do it for 20 grand.
Right.
It's 20 grand to do it.
Mm.
So some clubs are behind the eight ball, so to speak, because they have deferred maintenance. Whereas there's other clubs that have that asset base up to date and they have cash in the bank, to your point. So the answer, the big answer to the question is, the only way we see clubs succeeding at making the right amount of reserves is to develop a forward-looking capital plan that's complete. And in that capital plan, one of the things that we're going to do is build our reserves as well as get rid of deferred maintenance and reinvest. So you have to do all those things. The most critical financial metric is what we call net available capital, which is the amount of money a club has at the end of the year that it can do one of three things with. It can make capital investment, it can pay down debt, and it can put money in the bank for reserves. The problem in the industry is there's a hierarchy. You have to pay debt first, then you have to make capital investments, and then you have to build, and then you can build reserves. Too many clubs can pay the debt but not do capital investment, and those that can pay the debt and do capital investment may not have enough to build reserves. But that total plan to do all three over time is the key to it. But our estimate is only 5% of the clubs in the country have that plan.
Yeah.
Literally.
It seemed like a lot of clubs spent a lot in the last 5 years on renovations and great things. But what percent should you have been saving? What, like, if you could put a number or a percentage to that, you know, what should a club think to look to do over the course of a year?
So the median club has cash, total cash on hand, that's equivalent to 15% of its operating revenue. And that 15% includes no capital reserve. So the median club has no capital reserves. The 75th percentile is 25% of the operating revenue or more is in hand in cash. And the difference between the 15 and the 25, so a quarter of the clubs, that's capital reserve. So that 10% cushion, if you will, is really capital reserve. So about a quarter of the clubs in the country have some form of capital reserves, whereas most of the clubs just have enough cash on hand to operate the club.
Mm. So if you've got a board member who might be the loudest voice in the room this year, and he's got a big project in mind, what would you say to that member?
We just think that those big projects have to be part of that plan.
Yeah.
And when they're done in a one-off manner, that's when things get dicey.
Sure. Yep. That's well said. You got to think of things strategically, and really you're planning 5, 10, 20 years out if you're doing it right, I think. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to everyone here. If you've got a question for Ray, go ahead. This is your chance.
Hey, Ray,
Alan, oh, go ahead, Alan.
Thanks. Ray, you know me, always talking about safety, everything. Do you have any metrics from the not-for-profit, or I'll say for the for-profit clubs on safety? What are they putting in their budget for safety? I know private clubs don't have a safety line for budget, but that's the first thing that gets cut out.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I owe you an answer, by the way. But we see lots of we see about 1,000 trial balances a year from clubs. So we get to see their internal bookkeeping, and you just don't see that, that safety line on the budgets. You might see employee training. You see things like that. We tried to measure some of that. The numbers, though, as you well know, I think, if you looked at the whole industry, they're pretty low. They're very low. Yeah. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but we have tried to measure training as a piece of the total payroll compensation benefit stuff. And it was really low. In my head, for somehow I got 1% of the total payroll is a metric, and that's from a few months back, so it may or may not be correct. But if the average club is, of all clubs, with golf, without golf, is about 6.5 million in revenue, and about 56% of that is payroll at the median. So now you're in a 3.5, and if you said 1% of that is safety, you might be, or training, not even safety training, but just training, you might be at about 30 grand a year type of number.
Ray, you've always talked a lot, obviously, about long-term financial planning. We typically talk about strategic planning in clubs as an industry to be a 10-year thing, and that tends to be the physical, as we all know. But from your perspective, how many years is the appropriate amount of time for a club to think out financially?
We think that every club should have a capital reserve study or an asset reserve study that covers all the assets that's at least 20 years in the horizon. And we think that should be updated at least every 3 to 5 years. And then we think that that 20-year asset reserve study should drive a 10-year forward-looking capital model that balances the capital needs with the capital resources. And that plan gets updated every year. You add the 10th year on. It's just a rolling plan of 10 years. And you make sure that at the beginning of the 10 years, that you know over that 10-year window, you're going to have enough capital based on your membership intake and attrition assumptions. You'll have enough capital to do what Gabe had referred to earlier. You'll have enough capital to meet your capital investments, to pay down any debt you have, and to increase your reserves on the margin. So it's a 10-year window, Charles, ultimately, that we think clubs should embrace.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions out there for Ray? This is your opportunity to talk to the man himself. Ray, we appreciate you, sir. I'm sure there's more questions. Sometimes people are muted and they can't figure out how to unmute themselves. But
Thank you, Gabe.
If you don't mind, Ray, in the chat, please, if you're available to, maybe leave your email or any contact information for someone on your team. So if any questions do arise here, they can get in touch with you guys. Ray, thanks so much, man. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Akatz, Alan Akatz of Club Safety Solutions, to give us a little update on some of the safety measures that clubs should be looking at here as we start to reopen. Go ahead, Alan. It's your turn.
Well, thanks a lot, Gabe. And the first thing I have to say to everyone now is you're the experts of your operation. You know, everyone now knows what PPE stands for. Now the question is, how much PPE do you have? I had done a webinar yesterday, or I sat back and listened, and I've been doing a lot of listening as well as asking a lot of questions along the way. And Virginia's chapter, Ray was on presented yesterday, shared some great information, as well as he had a couple other people that were sharing information. And one of the co-presenters mentioned they have 2 months of personal protective equipment. Well, that's a whole lot of stuff. I mean, what are you using? I mean, we could talk about masks and what they just did in the state of North Carolina. They asked everyone to think of the 3 W's. And by the 3 W's is how to think of safety. They talk about wear your PPE. So is it your mask and your gloves? Wash your hands. We will give the government credit that we now know that we're supposed to spend 20 seconds of washing our hands nowadays. And then the third W is wait. And by that, wait 6 feet apart. How are we going to do that in bringing members back? You know, we're eliminating buffets. That's one thing. Or it will not be self-serve buffets anymore. So there goes everything from coffee stations to salad bars. But how are you going to be addressing what needs to be done? Everyone's going to have to develop standard operating procedures for your service standards. Are there going to be, are you eliminating tablecloths? Is everything going to be a hard surface? How are you going to sanitize? That's a whole series of questions that everyone's going to have to be looking at. You know, I will go to the mask for a second. Now, what are you doing for, I'll say N95s? You know, a couple months back, well, God, it's terrible to say a couple months already, but definitely 7 weeks ago, I had someone send me a quick note. Do you have any N95 respirators? And I had to laugh and say, yes, I have a box of them. Well, why? Well, I've been giving them away for 3+ years, okay? Here's respirators. Now, wearing an N95 is a difficult thing to do. And I just spoke with the dentist's office the other day. He has a staff member with an N95, and then they're putting another mask over that. Well, believe it or not, guys, you can't breathe if you have that much stuff on. A respirator will restrict what you're doing. Now, I have to laugh. What I just did, earlier is I grabbed a bandana. Can you all go and get a bandana? Put your bandana on and go where you're going. So now everyone's going to be a Frito Bandito. Well, in looking at a bandana, in my book, you might be better off with bandanas than a respirator. Why? Because the bandana is going to it's going to give you more airflow than something that is cupping and potentially restricting your air. And you're not as likely to be constantly moving it down. You'll be able to tie it up high enough. And if you think of everyone you're watching on the news, they keep talking and all of a sudden the respirator falls below their nose. Well, that's not a good seal in order to protect yourself.
I'll chime in on that real quick, Alan, before you go to your next point. I've seen a number of people just like wearing it and then their nose is just sticking out. And I'm like, what are you even bothering to wear that thing?
Well, the answer is yes. And the crazy one, I'll call it the pictures from Walmart. I saw a person wearing a sponge, okay, which isn't going to do anything for you anyhow. So in my book, and I'll say this, with a respirator, I would say use a bandana. You can know that they're going to be washed. You can buy them. You can get them logoed if you want, and then just have your staff wearing them. So let's talk about the hotline and bandanas for a second, or even the pantry, even the dishwasher. Can everyone wear a bandana? Well, what are people's habits? How often are they touching their face? It's one thing you're going to have to consider. Every time you touch your bandana, you touch your face, you have to go wash your hands. So now let's go with gloves. Are you going to have the right size gloves for everyone? Are they going to be form-fitting? Is it every task you do have to change your gloves? Well, believe it or not, guys, everyone's going to be at the sink washing their hands more than anything else. How long is the line? Are you going to have to put lines to get to the sink to wash your hands? I have a big sigh. It's going to be, when you reopen, there's just going to be question after question after question. And that's just with PPE. So there's masks and gloves that you're going to start with. Now, Ray brought up a good thing on training. Well, what training are you doing is the big question. Well, if you're going to have your employees sanitizing, what chemicals are they using? So now that means you're going to have them trained on the chemicals that they are going to come in contact with. Are they playing with spray bottles and everyone's spraying everything? How long does the spray work on a hard surface versus another surface? And you'll have to take a look at all your doorknobs, your light switches, your locker rooms, your faucets, the toilet stalls. You're going to have to touch on every basis just to make sure you're sanitizing. So are you going to have one person that's constantly sanitizing? As I'll say on safety, if you don't have safety in your budget, how can you cut it out? Well, once you start looking by department, put a safety line in there. If you're going to have one person that's constantly working to clean, well, know that the hours that are going for the cleaning. If you're buying all this PPE and you need a 2-month supply, put it in there so you have it in every department. Once you're tracking it, you'll know exactly what you do have. I shake my head, I've read everything on how we're doing golf carts and sanitizing golf carts. That's a lot of work there, from everything from the steering wheel to the cup holders to the bag rack. And now we're telling all the members, well, you have to put your gloves on, take them off. Are we still going to be full service operations? How long does it take to do all this sanitizing? Again, I don't know, but you're going to have to look at it and build on it from there. And, we can take a look. I see Mary, and I know Mary's at a yacht club. What are you doing to get your people in and out the golf clubs? Hi, Mary. Okay. How are you getting them on the boats? That's a whole nother series. What about swimming pools? How are you sanitizing the ladder? I'll be gross for a second, but I'm the safety guy. I know when I go swimming, if I get something up my nose, I expel everything out of that in the pool. Then the next step is I'm coming up to the ladder and I check for hangers and I grab the ladder. What are you doing to sanitize? Say, thank you, Charles, but you knew I was going to say that anyhow. What are you doing for that?
At least you're just maybe blowing your nose. So other people are doing some other things in that pool too.
Well, thank you very much. That's the safe area in the pool, okay? So,
But Alan, what's your advice then? I mean, do you think that clubs should have some sort of person dedicated to making sure that these standards are being met?
actually, Tony Shibiata mentioned that in her webcast with you. She's saying hire a full-time person just for sanitizing. Have it be your COVID person. And I'll echo what she's saying. You know, and that's where you're going to have to go with that safety budget line, because what are you doing? You know, it's a whole new reality out there nowadays, because if someone coughs or sneezes, you don't know if they're asymptomatic, and that rolls into thermometers. You know, are you going to use a forehead thermometer? Well, believe it or not, if someone's asymptomatic, you're not knowing if the person has it or not anyhow.
Right. So what would your best advice be then, Alan? If where's the silver lining here?
Hire a person, start training, cleaning, and constantly go through it.
Yeah.
Clubs have a lot of work that they're going to have to do now. And it's, you know, once you start tracking what's needed, you know, Charles and I were talking yesterday about food servers. You know, if they grab a tray or they pick something up, they now have to, what about your point of sale system? Is it going to be one person for using the point of sale system, or are you going to constantly sanitize? And what are you using for sanitizing wipes? Can you get them? I mean, that's a whole nother thing on the supply chain.
Yeah.
So I just have more questions that, you know, it feeds off it. And here's one I'll throw a curve at everyone. So the worst part or the craziest part about being a safety person is I constantly go down rabbit holes, and I just start doing research, and you just go deeper, deeper, and deeper. I got into ultraviolet sanitation the other day. And do you need ultraviolet for your air handler systems? Well, now once we're talking about air handlers, what is with your system? You know, has something been shut down? Do you have all your evaporator trays and everything else cleaned, you know, to make sure you don't have Legionella? I mean, that's a whole nother concern there.
Yeah, right. Well, I want to see if we can loop in Des here. I don't know if you got my message, Des, but Des is actually joining us from New Zealand. It's 3:00 in the morning. So first of all, thanks, Des, for doing that. But I know you guys have managed to pretty much come through this not unscathed, but definitely some good things happening there. So I'd love to hear from your perspective. What are clubs doing there? Maybe you got some things you can add on to what Alan just mentioned.
Thanks, Gabe. And from me, good morning or good afternoon in your case, and thank you for inviting me onto this session. As you know, New Zealand is an island nation, population of 5 million. Through the efforts of the government, we've been able to get out of this crisis pretty well. So at the moment, we've had 1,400 cases of COVID. Of those 1,400, 94% have recovered. We've had 21 deaths, and most of those have been from people in the 70 to 80, 90-year-old age group. And a lot of the cases that have come in to the country have come in from people returning from overseas. So the government put in a total border ban and asked that returning New Zealanders go into quarantine for 14 days on their return to the country. As far as the golf is concerned, it was total lockdown for 3 weeks, no course maintenance, which was a real problem for us. And the clubs finally got approval to get back out on and start cutting the greens and the fairways. At that stage, the total country was in lockdown. Everybody, like I've been at home now for 8 weeks, and slowly, as I've overnight, we've gone down to what we call level 2 alert. So that gives us more freedom to move around. And now the golfers are out and they can play in fours, whereas previous to that, they're either playing ones, or if they're in what they call their family bubble, they're able to play in twos.
Wow, they can only play in ones. That's a big change for a lot of people out there. What are you guys doing then from a safety perspective, or what sorts of things are happening to protect golfers there?
Okay, so our industry worked with the government to produce protocols to cover, first of all, course maintenance and what was required out there. and listed a whole, I think there was 40 points that the clubs and the staff had to implement. And then once that was up and running, then they did the same thing for the golfers and what they could do. And now the next stage is food and beverages is opening as of today. And that's presented a whole lot of problems, and, similar to what Alan's just covered. So as of now, the golfers can actually go into their clubhouse, and they're limited to sit at a table of 4, 1 meter distance, 1 server, and lots of sanitization right through every process.
Yeah. Thank you, Des, for that update. So I think, this is something that we should probably discuss here, and maybe we can brainstorm here with the group on, private club is a community of people. And when you've got restrictions like that, where you can only golf by yourself, where you can only sit at a table by yourself, obviously that whole community aspect is being lost right now. So maybe we should roundtable some solutions. Who's doing something interesting at your club? I know we had some really good ideas that came from this call last week about ways you're trying to involve the community. Who wants to answer that question? Hello. What are some of the things that you guys have been seeing? This is an unusual.
There's some things I've heard of.
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
I know there's some residential community clubs in Florida that are doing kind of neat. They have, as I understand it, it's a gentleman at one of the clubs who's a member, and he's an amateur musician. Not, completely amateur. He does gigs and stuff. And they've had him doing literally like virtual happy hours. So he plays the music. People get on Zoom, and everyone's drinking.
Yeah, they've been doing that at the Players in Manhattan. Michael, are you available to talk to us about what's the update there in New York City, and maybe what you guys have been doing? Because I know you're doing some innovative things at the club.
We've been trying a lot of virtual meetings, a lot of virtual gatherings. As you said, virtual happy hours. We'll do trivia events. We've encouraged our members to do a little thing called 2 Truths and a Lie.
I love that. You just did yours, right?
I just did mine, yeah. So it's
why don't you do it here live for us, if you don't mind? Give us the two truths and a lie. Let's see if we can guess. I think that'd be fun.
What was well, you don't know me. A lot of people guessed my lie because they knew me.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you just go on our Facebook page and you'll see. We've posted 7 or 8 of them so far, and basically we just asked the member to do a selfie video and pick 2 things that are true and 1 lie. And then one of our members is a good video editor. He puts it together and puts a little music to it and all of that and posts it. And it's a great way to engage the members because everybody's guessing. And then after a couple of days, we reveal what it is.
Yours was like you held an Oscar. What were the other 2?
I've held, yes. One was that I held an Oscar, but not the one of our members, one of my good friends, won an Oscar. He's a screenwriter. And everybody knows that I'm friends with him. So I said it wasn't his. Was that I had worked as a professional clown for a year. And the third was that I had a daughter that I did not meet until she was 19 years old.
All right, so let's throw it out there. Let's get some guesses actually in the chats. I think this would be fun. So your first one is he's held an Oscar, but it wasn't his member's Oscar. Number 2, he used to be a professional clown, and number 3, he's got a daughter that he didn't know about until he was 19. So let's see if we get a couple answers here in the chat. I think that'd be really fun. But I love the way you guys have been doing that, and I'd love to actually play along. Unfortunately, I'm not a club member, but I see the posts come through, so I've been wanting.
Definitely definitely jump on the happy hour once in a while if you get a chance. I know you're busy.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. So we got clown. One answer has come in. We got one vote for clown, one for daughter. Who else wants to answer this question? This is pretty fun. It's probably something we should do on this call. Maybe we next week we should get together and do this. But what a great way to just build some morale. To actually get to know your members in this time of social.
We've done a trivia. We've done a trivia night. Basically, the member who was running it, she not only read all of the questions. She had three categories, 10 questions each. She not only read it, but she had it on cue cards. So basically, she held up the question and read it, and then you marked down what you thought the answer was. I mean, it took 30, 45 minutes or so to do the whole thing, but everyone was engaged, and then at the end, you had to show your if you claimed that you got them all or you got 8 out of 10, you had to hold up your sheet of paper that you had originally written it down on. So
I love it. So what's the answer? We got most people chose daughter. We've got one clown in there.
It was the daughter line. So
it is the daughter. Wow.
Most of the members have guessed that because they know me well enough.
Charles Dorn is celebrating there in the background.
It's the New York thing. What can I say?
I love that though. Thank you, Michael. That I've really admired what you guys have been doing over at the Players during this time, and a club that people can't walk through the doors yet. What's the update in Manhattan? When do you think things could?
Announced today that Broadway they're going to be giving refunds through September 6th.
Wow.
There's definitely no live theater until after that. And the reality is, in my personal opinion, I don't think there'll be any live theater in New York this year. I think it's going to take until January. We're struggling with whether we can open. Obviously, New York is among the hardest hit and will be the last to open up. And bars and restaurants and clubs will be among the last to open up as well. So I've got a board meeting next week, and we're not going to make any decisions then until we hear something more from the government. But the reality is, I'm not sure we can open in the summer at all. Typically, we close in August anyway. So if we were not going to be able to open until, say, July 1st, it's kind of a big economic loss to just try to open for the couple of weeks of July. And even if we continued it on to August and stayed open for August this year, the loss of our banquet business is devastating. And so I have an operation that I can hold the line if the members continue to pay the dues and we're not open. As soon as I do open without any banquet business, I'm losing lots of money. And that's a real challenge. How long can you expect your members to continue to support your club? And Ray, I really appreciate, I think it was in your white paper that I read, was it about owners versus customers? Is that right? Yeah. And I really took that to heart, and I've been pushing that through my executive committee and my board about the fact that we are owners, and this is not like a gym membership where you're just a customer. It's our club, and we are a nonprofit as well, so it makes it even more so. There's no owner reaping rewards from this or taking losses. It's our club collectively. So I did take that.
And you get, like you said, Michael, you get hit harder because you have a more leveraged operating model because of the banquets.
Yeah, and I have to admit that we're more in the red zone than the yellow zone, and we've got a substantial debt that we're servicing, and we're trying to renegotiate that loan right now with our lender. But it's tough when you can't plan for revenue at all. I got a lot of members who are just dying to come back, but I can't legally do it, and secondly, when they do, what constrictions? We've got a multi-level townhouse, so I can move our pub grill operation that's on one of the lower levels to the banquet level and spread people out. But at the same time, I can't encourage 100 people to show up for happy hour or for early dinner or something like that, because we're going to be exceeding what I'm sure the government will allow us to do in New York. So it's tough challenges, yeah.
By the way, I know we've got a couple of financial guys. We have Ray on the call. We also have Joe Abley. Michael last week asked a question. They were considering potentially changing their 501c7 status. So if either of you gentlemen have seen a club go through that process, Michael would really appreciate an answer. I'll let you guys take that offline. But if you've ever seen a club that's gone from 501c7 to, was it 3 you're going to go to?
Yeah, I mean, we have 2 501c3s that are associated with us. One about the historic building and doing renovations. One is an educational foundation. And if I could turn, this is very early ideas, but if I could turn, there's a lot of history here, as you know, Gabe. This is a huge repository of the American theater history. If I could turn the club to a 501c3, make the necessary adaptations that would be required of us to be a public good and have charitable things that we were doing, I could attract grants, I could attract tax deductible donations, and I might very well roll in the other 2 foundations into the club and bring it all under one roof. But it's just something we're talking about, we're beginning to talk about. I spoke to another club that's a 501c3 and just to understand where the guardrails were in his organization. But I haven't spoke to anybody yet that's tried to make that transition yet.
Yeah, so Ray or Joe, if either you gentlemen have an idea for Michael, he'd be grateful for sure. Charles, before we really got started here, you were kind of giving us an update on New York. Any other words you can offer us?
No, I was just thinking about what Michael was talking about, and Michael's model in the city is one. The other model that it's really challenging is so many of our clubs have guest bedrooms. And the problem with the guest bedroom model in a normal scenario, back in a million years ago when I was still in operations, I took 75% of my bedroom revenue to the bottom line, and it paid for a lot of evils. But the reality is, with the hotel market being so crazy as it is now in the city, if you used to want to be able to stay at the Four Seasons and didn't want to pay the $1,300 average daily rate, the Four Seasons is probably going to reopen at $600 or $700, which then means the St. Regis that was at $600 or $700 is probably going to reopen at $250 or $300. Well, reality is, are you more likely to stay in the club, if the club is open, or will you stay at the St. Regis for a couple $100 because you always wanted to stay there and didn't want to spend the money? Because the hotel room revenue in New York City is a trickle-down deal. The clubs are almost the last. There's always going to be members who stay with us and eat with us because they're members, but the people coming in from out of town, frankly, like that convenience of having restaurants that are open 24/7 and room service and those kind of things. So the guys that have, I shouldn't say guys, the clubs that have bedrooms are really in a precarious situation, because the question is, and Michael's comment about September 1st, I have clients that I know of in the city that are talking about potentially not opening before September 1st for exactly the reason that Michael spoke about. We're not going to have any business in the summer because that doesn't even take into consideration those group of members, our older members, who don't even want to come out until there's a vaccine or whatever the eventual medical issue is. But the reality is that maybe they're not going to open their bedrooms until January 1. Because if the theater, and I agree with Michael 100%, I don't think we're going to see Broadway open until January 1 at the earliest, and I don't think anybody's talking about it. But that also prohibits or precludes people from coming to New York. All our non-residents and all our tourists and stuff like that. So, I think we all talk about opening in stages. I think the city clubs in New York in particular, and Ray and I were offline talking about Boston and New England, I think it's the same thing. I think it's going to be a very gradual, piecemeal thing. And that's even before we start talking about the stuff that Alan and I have been talking about virtually on a daily basis, because he and I get frustrated about safety stuff, and we literally call back and forth almost every day. The other thing that really concerns me, and I don't know how to deal with this, and I hear this probably a half a dozen times a day, is everybody on this call, we're preaching to the choir. I mean, this group knows fundamentally what needs to be done, but I am so tired of club managers calling me and saying, I don't know how to handle this. my president, my board. It's no different than Ray has been dealing with for all these years about financial. They go down, using Alan's phrase, the rabbit hole, the wrong direction. They're doing the same thing right now. 2 weeks ago, I had a club that announced in New York they were going to start using golf carts. I found out about it. I sent them the proper information. And thankfully, a day later, they said, nope, we can't use golf carts. They just decided 2 days ago to put the same note out to their membership. They don't care that the governor of the state of New York doesn't want golf carts in private clubs. They're doing it, and they're saying we're on strong legal ground. They are on no legal ground.
Yeah.
And that stuff. There's another club on Long Island, and obviously I'd never talk about who it is. Their superintendent was out doing some work, and he had an accident. And thankfully, the gentleman will be fine. He's like the most fit guy you know. From what I understand, he's a runner. He runs marathons, et cetera, beloved at the club. Guy goes to the hospital. He's got a bunch of broken ribs. They do a virus test on him. He's asymptomatic, but he's got the virus. So he calls the GM. He says to the GM, hey, by the way, I've got the virus. Obviously, it's not quite as calm as that. And the GM takes it to the president and says, we need to close the club for 2 weeks, if for no other reason, for perception for the membership, if it ever got out. And the president says, no, we're not closing the club.
Scary, man.
GM says, what do I do? I said, look for a new job. I mean, that's not somebody you really want to work for. But there's a ton of this stuff. Another guy called me yesterday that said, we're stressing social distancing. We started to open up a little bit. It was not somebody in New York. And what happens, I walk out on the porch yesterday, and there's 12 guys sitting around at one table, and our president is right in the middle of the group of 12. So that's what bothers me more than anything.
Clubs have to take this seriously. Obviously, you're opening yourself up, like you said, to legal action if you don't take the right precautions, and you really need to have be more cautious than you even think you should be, I think, is the lesson here. Yep. I want to leave the last word today with Ray, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, Ray, but for clubs like Michael's, they've lost their banquet facilities. For other clubs who have lost hotel revenues, if you could wave a magic wand, Ray, what would be one of the ways that you would look to recoup some of those lost revenues? Would it be either A, going hard after new members? Would it be B, assessing the membership? Or C, what else would you be able to offer us?
I think I'd say there's two types of clubs. There's clubs that, back to your earlier question, Gabe, and point. There's clubs that have the reserves and the ability to mainly absorb the loss. And if a club can absorb the loss, and it means you have one kind of bumpy year amongst many, that's probably the way to go. And then there's the group of clubs that really can't absorb the loss because they don't have the reserves or the strength of the balance sheet. And, back to Michael's point and what we say, I think you're trying to use this as an opportunity to realize the club survival means the owners have to step up, and maybe the loss is going to have to be meted out as an assessment, whether it's a operating assessment, capital assessment, et cetera. But that's really the only choices I think that exist. And then of course there's a spectrum in between. Maybe you can absorb some of it, but not all of it, so that minimizes the amount you have to ask for. But I think it's a time like this that, in a club like Michael's, which is many, many years old, and I think Michael's led a revival of it recently. You want to keep that revival going, and it might mean that the members have to cough up a little extra money this year.
Yep. And maybe even ask for a little bit more than you need to cover this year, because if we need to go into next year, I think that's probably would be wise. So Ray, thanks so much for joining us. Alan, thank you for adding your information to this call, and everyone who participated. Des, coming all the way from New Zealand at 3 a.m, you get the gold star of the day. I hope you guys can catch us. Well, do you think that I'd love to hear a raise of hands or questions. Should we do this again next week, or are you busy getting in operations? Let me know. That way I'll decide if we're going to do a call next week, or if maybe we put it down the road a week. But I don't want to overwhelm people. I know there's a lot of these webinars and things happening. So I appreciate everyone's time who did join. And again, I do want to talk about topics that you're interested in if we do this again. whether it's next week or a week or 2 weeks from today. So let me know. Please shoot me an email about subjects that are meaningful to you, or advice that you'd want to share with others if you weren't available to speak up today on the call. But I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully I'll see you at 3 p.m. In Ecuador. It's going to be fun. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you later.